Crete sits between the Aegean and the Libyan Sea, a long mountain lifted by the Hellenic arc, its ranges stepping from the White Mountains in the west to Ida and Dicte toward the east. In this landscape, people move along valleys and seasonal rivers, settle where cold springs break from karst, and look outward across straits that open toward the Cyclades Anatolia and the Nile world. The island's position makes crossings neither trivial nor impossible stretches of open water, punctuated by islands supplied by winds that in summer often blow from the northwest. The sea narrows and widens in usable steps. A cautious mariner can hug the north shore. Time departures to breeze and swell and reach other nodes of the eastern Mediterranean without losing land from sight for long. The geography grants options. North-facing embayments offer roadsteads. South coast coves shelter from the Meltemi. Saddles between ridges give overland paths from one coast to the other in a day's walk. The ground that enables surplus is varied. The Masara Plain spreads wide in the south, a basin edged by hills where soils accumulate. Smaller plains and river fans dot the north. Thin upland soils are held by stone terraces. Downslope alluvium deepens and holds winter moisture. Cypress pine and evergreen oak supply beams and planks. Clays along streams fire into cooking ware, and later the great pythoi that stabilize temperature for grain and oil. Limestone quarries split into workable blocks. Caves provide cool rooms for storage and for gatherings that mark seasons. Obsidian appears from Melos in the Neolithic, its glassy edges carried in small lots that signal exchange networks already in motion before palatial centers coalesce. In the early Holocene climate in the eastern Mediterranean, settles into a warmer, relatively stable pattern than the glacial extremes that came before, though multi-century pulses of dryness and storminess persist. That rhythm favors farmers who experiment with wheat and barley pulses, such as lentil and chickpea, and herds of sheep, goats, and cattle distributed across microclimates. Rain falls mainly in cool months. Summers are dry, so springs cisterns and careful scheduling of labor matter. On ridges, threshing floors take wind to separate grain and chaff. In depressions, ponds, and soils trap moisture to carry fields through late spring. Olive and grape cultivation expand as knowledge of pruning, grafting, and pressing builds each step, binding households more tightly to places where slope drainage and frost patterns cooperate. Archaeology traces human presence deep into the Neolithic. A widely accepted fact anchors the timeline early farmers reach Crete by the 7th millennium BCE, bringing seed animals and polished stone tools across open sea. The voyage implies boats capable of carrying families and cargo with repeatable reliability. One lesser-known detail reported from terrace deposits near Plakias on the south coast is the recovery of Pleistocene-age stone artifacts that some researchers read as evidence for far earlier visits. Others argue they could be redeposited tools moved by erosion. Either way, the question highlights an unresolved mystery about how soon and how often mariners attempted the crossing before farming becomes visible in the record. In these early communities, choices about location, water, and movement gradually standardize. Villages gather near springs and arable fans. Paths to upland grazing become seasonal routines. Landing places gain built features, leveled ground, laid stones, perhaps a line of stakes to ease loading and repair. A subtle organization emerges, not a state, but a shared set of solutions to the island's recurrent problems of seasonality, storage, and exchange. As households coordinate labor, the mechanics of storing and moving food become central. Terraces extend fields. Fallow cycles pace soil recovery. Pythoi, eventually shoulder-high jars, are set into earthen floors to stabilize humidity. Ceilings and marks begin to regulate access and memory of what is stored. Trackways harden across saddles where pack animals can pass. Along the north coast, small roadsteads serve as points where boats ride out winds and hop from promontory to promontory. Near Knossos, low-lying ground by the Kairos River affords a practical link between inland settlement and sea access and arrangement that later administrators will formalize. The sea itself structures connection. In summer, the Etesians press from the northwest, encouraging southbound and eastbound runs and complicating returns. In transitional seasons, variable winds open more options. A day's cautious coastal sail links cove to cove along the north shore. A voyage of roughly a day or two under fair winds reaches Thera and the central Cyclades. Longer legs touch the Dodecanese and the Anatolian coast. To the south, beyond the gulfed shoreline, lie routes toward the Libyan littoral and farther the Nile Delta. The distances are real, but they are scaled to human endurance so that the island feels connected rather than isolated. Tectonics adds both hazard and structure. Earthquakes recur along the subduction system beneath the island. Coasts rise and fall by centimeters or meters over centuries. Harbors silt or deepen, and stone courses remember shocks. People respond by binding walls with timber lacing that allows flex by choosing sites on firm fans rather than on soft deltas, and by keeping repair as a regular craft. The same forces that shake houses also maintain steep slopes that catch winter rains and release them through springs, and they raise marine terraces that provide flat, drainable platforms for settlement. Adaptation becomes routine rather than exceptional. On the scale of the planet, post-glacial seas continue their slow rise through the early Holocene and then stabilize so that by the 3rd and 2nd millennia, BCE coastlines generally hold and landing places can be used across generations. Climate teleconnections link the island to changes far away monsoon strength. North Atlantic oscillations and Saharan winds modulate rainfall and dust over Crete. The island's story thus folds into planetary patterns. When glaciers grow elsewhere, sea levels dip and shelves widen. When subtropical highs shift, storms angle differently across the basin. And on Crete, these shifts express themselves as slight changes in planting windows, pasture health, and the reliability of springs. Through such coupling, local practice stays legible against global change. By the time later observers call the society that emerges here Europe's first great civilization, much of the enabling groundwork is in place. People map microclimates and soils to crops and herds. They learn the habits of wind and swell. They build habits of storage, sealing, and accounting that make seasonal surplus legible and retrievable. Exchange networks already tie the island to neighbors. Obsidian from Melos appears in Neolithic contexts. Later copper from Cyprus and other ores will join the flow. What begins as flexibility in the face of seasonality becomes a standing infrastructure: terraces, threshing floors, magazines, landing places that allows surpluses to be protected, tracked, and exchanged. From this prepared geography and practice, the next step, palatial concentration of resources and authority, becomes thinkable. The crossroads is not a metaphor, but a working description of wind, water, stone, and routine. Here, development does not start with a king. It starts with a coastline and a calendar. The island thus stands ready for palaces, not as an interruption to island logic, but as its amplification. The first palaces rise on Crete in the early 2nd millennium BCE, about 2,000 years after the first farmers had settled villages across the island. Archaeology confirms a fact: widely accepted monumental centers appear at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and later Zakros, places where storage, ceremony, and administration concentrate at a scale not seen before in the Aegean. The structures are vast agglomerations of halls, magazines, stairways, and courtyards built with ashlar blocks, carefully dressed and fitted. Wide central courts aligned to cardinal points or mountain horizons become gathering spaces for festivals or rituals, and storerooms lined with pithoi extend in ranks, holding grain oil or wine for redistribution. Corridors and staircases lead visitors through sequences of light and shadow, narrowing and opening to frame experience. Within these complexes, walls bear frescoes of naturalistic scenes, lilies, dolphins, bull, leaping athletes set above polished gypsum floors. The architecture reflects not only engineering skill, but a new form of social order where authority projects itself through planned space, shared ritual, and control of stored goods. A lesser-known detail is the use of gypsum from local quarries cut into translucent slabs that could refract light in stairwells and corridors, a feature unusual in the Bronze Age Mediterranean and part of the island's distinctive architectural signature. The unresolved mystery concerns the identity of those who ruled. No monumental tombs, no statues of kings, no explicit records of dynasties survive. Ceilings, tablets, and iconography imply administrators and religious figures, but whether Crete had monarchs like later Mycenaeans, councils of elites, or priestly authorities remains debated. The absence of fortifications around early palaces suggests a confidence in maritime control or diplomatic relations, rather than in defensive walls setting the Minoans apart from contemporaneous states. On a planetary scale, the palatial fluorescence coincides with stable climatic conditions across the eastern Mediterranean in the early second millennium, when rainfall supported cereal surpluses and seaborne trade intensified between Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean. This background stability enables Cretan architects to invest in complexes that take generations to plan and build, reflecting confidence in continuity. Within each palace, administration expands. The first scripts on Cretan hieroglyphic and later linear A appear on seal stones and clay tablets recording inventories and accounts. Storerooms preserve impressions of reed matting that once covered jars, showing standardized practices of sealing and tracking. Corridors direct flows of goods and people. Courts host rituals linked to seasonal cycles. At Knossos, the largest center, the plan grows into a labyrinthine mass of over 1,000 rooms whose complexity later inspires the Greek myth of the labyrinth. Yet this intricacy is not confusion, but management of storage, movement, and ceremony. The buildings function as living machines that process agricultural surplus into ritual spectacle and redistributive power. Visitors entering through processional corridors are guided toward the central court, where rituals perhaps involving bulls or other symbolic animals take place, binding communities to the authority of the palace. Palaces stand as nodes in a network rather than isolated strongholds. Malea on the north coast oversees routes toward the Cyclades in Anatolia. Phaistos dominates the fertile Messara plain and faces the Libyan Sea. Zakros at the east controls approaches to Cyprus and the Levant. Knossos, centrally located, balances connections in all directions. Each palace manages local hinterlands while maintaining inter-island exchange, a system that magnifies Crete's reach. The island becomes a web of complementary centers, each adapted to local geography, but sharing architectural and administrative templates. Ritual reinforces political order. Frescoes depict processions, libations, and animal sacrifices, though details remain enigmatic. Figurines of women with raised armed serpents or elaborate headdresses suggest priestly roles. Bull iconography dominates visible in Rita libation vessels carved in stone shaped like bovine heads. Whether these images record specific deities or more fluid symbolic associations is debated, yet they testify to a religious life woven into architecture and storage. The court's alignments with solstices or mountain peaks suggest cosmological integration, situating the palace not only in social space, but in celestial cycles. Beneath the grandeur, practical needs persist. Agricultural surpluses require organization, and palaces supply granaries with thick walls and narrow vents for stability. Olive oil, once processed in press facilities, is stored in massive jars, each capable of holding hundreds of liters. Wool from sheep is spun, woven, and possibly traded as cloth, a commodity prized across the Bronze Age world. Metals arrive from afar, smelted cast, and worked into tools and ornaments. The palace's workshops produce seal stones of steatite or hard stones engraved with minute motifs enabling secure identification of goods. The integration of craft and storage underlines the palace's role as command centers for production. The mystery of governance extends to social hierarchy. Excavated houses near palaces, such as the Little Palace or Villa Ariadne at Knossos, show elite residences echoing palatial styles on smaller scales. These suggest a layered society where local elites participate in wider networks of power. Yet the lack of ostentatious tombs contrasts sharply with Mycenaean shaft graves or Egyptian pyramids, raising questions about how Minoan leaders projected identity. Perhaps authority expressed itself more through ritual performance and monumental architecture than through personal commemoration. On the larger Mediterranean canvas, Crete's palaces fit into a contemporaneous pattern of state formation. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom consolidates rule along the Nile. In Mesopotamia, city-states expand bureaucracy and temple economies. Across the Aegean, however, Crete stands out as the only island to generate such monumental centers, leveraging its position between continents. The sea, rather than isolating, empowers the growth of a civilization whose architecture and art project confidence and sophistication. Seismic reality, though, underlies construction. Timber lacing in walls built to absorb shocks shows that earthquakes were expected. Floors collapse and are rebuilt. Fire marks layers. Palaces at times fall and rise again, testament to resilience. This cycle of destruction and rebuilding shapes the palatial tradition itself, embedding renewal into cultural practice. Indeed, the first palaces around 1900 BCE suffer destructions a few centuries later, yet are rebuilt larger and more complex in what archaeologists call the neo-palatial period. Through this process, architecture becomes palimpsest. Each generation reinterprets and expands upon earlier foundations. The planetary perspective reminds us that Crete's fluorescence is tethered to larger forces. Climate stability sea roots shaped by windy, tectonic hazards underfoot. Human ingenuity adapts these conditions into palatial grandeur, but the same setting holds potential for abrupt change. For now, however, the island enters a period of confidence. Palaces anchor, society trade circulates across seas, and art blossoms into forms that remain iconic. From the vantage of these early centuries, Crete appears as a stable and radiant hub, a place where stone, plaster, and ceremony fuse into an order that seems destined to endure. Yet the very systems that sustain it, complex storage reliance on sea trade building, on seismic ground, carry vulnerabilities that will later be exposed. For the moment, though, the island shines in the light of new palaces, a civilization announcing itself in stone and color to the wider Mediterranean world. Architecture and administration on Minoan Crete reach a scale and complexity that transform the island society into something recognizably state-like, though not in the rigid sense of later empires. At Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros, architecture does more than house, it organizes. The broad central court becomes the axis around which daily activity and ceremonial gatherings pivot, while long corridors of magazines demonstrate logistical planning that anticipates modern principles of storage and inventory. Archaeologists consistently emphasize one fact: Minoan palaces display a high degree of planned asymmetry, modularity, and attention to circulation that speaks of centralized authority with the ability to mobilize labor and resources on an island-wide scale. The use of ashlar masonry and walls terracotta pipes for water and drainage and gypsum paving slabs for interior surfaces indicates a knowledge of engineering, unmatched in the Aegean of the second millennium BCE. A lesser-known detail is the sophistication of the plumbing system's terracotta pipes, laid with jointed angles to reduce pressure-flushing drains that carried away waste, and even systems interpreted as early toilets. These innovations suggest a concern not just with grandeur, but with hygiene and efficiency. The unresolved mystery is the precise mechanism of governance. Clay tablets inscribed in linear A record commodities and accounts, but the script remains undeciphered, so we cannot yet know whether they record taxes, rations, or offerings. The absence of explicit royal names or portraits means that the ruling class hides behind bureaucracy and ritual rather than proclaiming themselves in stone or writing. The silence leaves open questions. Did the palaces serve collective governance, religious administration, or something resembling monarchy? This uncertainty remains one of the most enduring puzzles of Aegean prehistory. From a planetary perspective, the Minoan palaces embody a civilization that adapts to environmental constraints by turning architecture into infrastructure. The island's earthquakes demand timber reinforcements. Its variable rainfall leads to centralized storage. Its maritime position encourages integration of harbors and inland roads. Architecture thus becomes a bridge between local environment and global connectivity. Palatial buildings accumulate additions over centuries, but the coherence of their plans suggests oversight by administrators who understood geometry and spatial order. Knossos especially grows into a complex that rivals small towns. In scale, with over 1,000 interlinked rooms, the complexity inspires later myths of labyrinthine corridors, but in practical terms it reflects administrative needs: separate magazines for grain oil and wine, workshops for metal, stone, and textiles, archive rooms for tablets and seals, courts for ceremony. Each architectural element ties directly into the logistics of collecting, storing, processing, and redistributing goods. Administrative technology underpins the system. Seal stones carved from steatite jasper or other stones carry intricate motifs, spirals, animals, or abstract designs pressed into clay ceilings that close jars, doors, or chests. The impression identifies responsibility and authenticity, an early form of signature. Thousands of these ceilings have been recovered evidence of a bureaucracy where goods were not just stored, but formally recorded, authorized, and tracked. Alongside ceilings, linear A tablets serve as ledgers, capturing the flow of goods through palaces. Though undeciphered, the structure of the writing shows lists, tallies, and categorical groupings consistent with accounting. The tablets, often preserved accidentally by fire, provide glimpses into the otherwise invisible machinery of management. At a daily level, the system ties households and regions to palaces. Farmers deliver produce artisans supply textiles or tools, and administrators register quantities. The redistribution model implies that palaces stored goods to be issued at festivals as rations or as trade commodities. In effect, architecture embodies a system where surplus moves inward from fields and outward again through ritual and exchange. This centralization sustains elites, but also stabilizes society against local shortages buffering households from risk. One lesser-known aspect is the role of villas, smaller elite complexes in the countryside that replicate palatial features on a reduced scale. Sites such as Aya Triada or Nero Chani display magazines, courts, and frescoes similar to those in major palaces. These suggest a hierarchy of administration where local elites manage production and funnel goods towards central nodes. The villas tie hinterlands to palaces, extending the architectural and administrative model across the island. The unresolved issue is the degree of political unity. Some scholars argue for a unified Minoan state centered at Knossos, while others see multiple competing polities that share cultural templates. The archaeological record allows both interpretations. The architectural uniformity hints at shared administration, yet regional variations and occasional destructions point to local autonomy. The truth may lie in shifting balances, with Knossos rising to dominance only after cycles of rebuilding. Whatever the structure, architecture demonstrates shared values and methods across the island. Ritual spaces connect directly with administration. Courts and shrines sit adjacent to storerooms, linking the sacred and the practical. Festivals, perhaps tied to seasonal cycles of harvest or to astronomical events, occur in spaces framed by magazines full of stored goods, so that religious authority and economic control reinforce one another. Frescoes of processions and offerings depict this fusion where art, ritual, and storage merge into a single system of legitimation. Architecture then becomes the visible face of invisible authority, making order tangible. On the planetary scale, Crete's palatial system mirrors developments elsewhere, yet remains distinctive. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats and palace temple complexes integrate religion and administration. In Egypt, massive temples and pyramids monumentalize kingship. In the Indus Valley planned, cities manage water and trade. Crete participates in this global Bronze Age phenomenon of monumental complexity, but does so with unique emphasis on open courts plumbing and frescoes that celebrate nature rather than war. The absence of fortifications in early palaces suggests an order built on sea power diplomacy or a relative security during a period of broad stability in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet earthquakes leave their mark. Floors, collapsed walls are rebuilt, and fire scars, layers of debris. The palaces endure through cycles of destruction and renewal, a rhythm almost geological. This resilience shows administrative continuity. The same plans are reimposed, sometimes enlarged, as though the idea of the palace transcends individual rulers. Architecture itself becomes tradition, each rebuilding affirming cultural identity. As centuries pass, the scale of planning grows. Corridors align with views to mountains, suggesting intentional cosmological connections. Lightwell's staircases and porticos manage movement of both people and air, showing an interest in comfort as well as ceremony. Storage magazines expand in number and capacity, evidence of ever larger surpluses. The architecture articulates a civilization confident in its ability to mobilize, administer, and endure. Yet this very complexity carries risks. As systems grow dependent on centralized storage and intricate bureaucracy, they become vulnerable to disruption. A fire in archives can erase records. An earthquake can collapse storage rooms. A missed harvest can undermine redistribution. The integration that sustains prosperity also magnifies fragility. For now, however, the palaces thrive. They dominate landscapes, coordinate resources, and display a distinctive architectural language that marks Minoan Crete as a singular civilization. The wide courts echo with footsteps, the magazines hold rows of sealed jars, and administrators press seal stones into clay, each impression a silent record of exchange. The island is knit together through corridors of stone and networks of account architecture embodying authority and administration at once. In this moment, the civilization appears orderly and secure, a system of buildings and records poised at its peak, awaiting only the next cycle of disruption to reveal the fragility beneath its stone and plaster. Art and belief on Minoan Crete are preserved in fragments of fresco figurine vessel and seal, each offering glimpses into a world where color and ritual saturate daily life and elite display. Archaeologists note a clear fact: Minoan fresco painting, beginning in the early 2nd millennium BCE, reaches a level of naturalism and vibrancy unlike anything else in the Aegean at that time. At Knossos, dolphins swim across walls. In chambers near light wells, lilies bloom in painted fields, and youths vault over bulls in scenes of motion and rhythm. At Akrotiri on Thera, Minoan outpost walls carry flotillas of ships, monkeys climbing rocks, and girls gathering saffron. This art emphasizes nature, ritual, and activity rather than warfare, marking Minoan culture with a distinctive aesthetic. A lesser-known detail lies in the pigments Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment requiring high heat processing, appears on frescoes, showing technological exchange with the Nile world. The use of pumice plaster, abundant after eruptions in the region, creates durable surfaces that preserve color for millennia. The unresolved mystery is the interpretation of ritual scenes. The famous bull-leaping fresco shows male and female figures engaged in acrobatic jumps over charging bulls. Whether this was a literal sport, a ritual metaphor, or both is debated. No preserved arena confirms repeated performances, yet iconography recurs so consistently that bulls clearly held central symbolic value. Were they linked to fertility, seasonal renewal, or celestial cycles? Scholars disagree, but all recognize the motif as a defining image of Minoan belief. On a planetary scale, Minoan art reflects a society deeply tied to natural cycles. The Mediterranean climate, with wet winters and dry summers, conditions the themes of lilies blooming in spring and marine imagery tied to seasonal voyages. The Aegean light, harsh and clear, seems echoed in the sharp outlines of figures, while the island's biodiversity, dolphins, ibex, lilies, fills frescoes with local specificity. Art becomes both environmental record and cultural expression of an island bound to sea and land. Religious practice intertwines with art. Figurines of women with flounced skirts, bare chests, and raised arms, or snakes coiled in their hands, suggest priestly or divine roles. These images, recovered from Knossos and other sites, are small but powerful, often placed in shrines. They raise questions about gender and Minoan religion. Did women hold formal authority as priestesses, or do these figurines represent goddesses? The lack of inscriptions leaves the answer open. Yet the prominence of female figures in ritual art distinguishes Minoan belief from many contemporaneous systems where male warrior kings dominate imagery. Shrines within palaces often sit adjacent to storerooms, emphasizing the unity of sacred and economic life. Horns of consecration, stylized representations of bull horns carved from stone-lined roofs and courtyards signaling sacred boundaries. Double axes or labrys appear in ritual contexts carved into walls or carried as symbolic objects. Whether they served as cult emblems, tools of sacrifice, or cosmological symbols remains debated. These objects, coupled with frescoes of processions, reveal a religious landscape where symbols rather than texts carried meaning. Without deciphered records, interpretation depends on context and repetition. Festivals likely structured time. Central courts aligned with solstices or mountain peaks may have hosted seasonal ceremonies. Processional frescoes suggest groups moving in ordered sequence carrying vessels, flowers, or offerings. Music and dance, attested by instruments in frescoes and figurines, accompanied rituals. Libation tables riata in shapes of bulls or seashells, and stone basins testify to practices of pouring liquid offerings. These rituals tie human cycles to agricultural and cosmic rhythms, reaffirming the role of palaces as both storage centers and sacred theaters. A lesser-known artifact category, sealstone iconography, offers miniature windows into belief. Tiny engravings show animals, hybrid creatures, or scenes of worship before trees or columns. These images suggest that sacred spaces were not only palaces, but also natural sites, mountain peaks, caves, and sacred groves. Peak sanctuaries, small shrines built high on ridges, contain clay figurines of humans and animals likely left as offerings visible to surrounding communities. This duality of palace and peak sanctuary links the sacred with both built and natural landscapes. The unresolved question is whether the Minoans had a pantheon akin to later Greek gods, or a more fluid set of symbolic forces tied to nature. Trees and pillars recur as sacred images. Animals such as bulls, goats, and birds accompany rituals. Without texts, we cannot know the names or myths, but we see a system where art encodes belief through recurring motifs. On the planetary scale, the Minoan integration of art and religion fits into Bronze Age patterns, where monumental art communicates ideology. In Egypt, temples bear reliefs of gods and pharaohs. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals depict rituals before deities. Crete shares this impulse, but channels it into frescoes of nature and ritual without centralized depictions of rulers. Authority legitimizes itself through alignment with natural cycles and sacred performance rather than through images of kings. This orientation resonates with an island society dependent on seasonal agriculture and maritime trade. Art is not confined to palaces. Frescoes appear in elite villas, and even modest houses, showing that aesthetic values spread beyond the ruling class. Pottery carries motifs of octopuses, spirals, and floral designs linking everyday vessels to the same symbolic vocabulary as monumental art. The marine style in particular reflects a society oriented toward the sea, its imagery swimming across jars, traded throughout the Aegean. Thus, art not only decorates, but also travels, carrying Minoan identity outward. Another lesser-known detail comes from the Hagia Triada sarcophagus, a painted limestone coffin from the 14th century BCE. Its scenes show processions of figures making offerings, playing instruments, and presenting animals for sacrifice. The imagery combines Minoan and Mycenaean elements, illustrating both continuity and transformation as external influences grow. The sarcophagus captures ritual and action, freezing motion and sound into durable form. Such artifacts confirm that belief was not abstract, but enacted, binding communities through repeated gestures. Ritual also integrates landscape. Caves such as Sycro on Mount Dicte or Idaion on Mount Ida contain offerings of bronze figurines, libation tables, and double axes. These places, difficult to reach, indicate that pilgrimage formed part of religious life. Peak sanctuaries, caves, and palaces create a sacred geography where Hydarch and central places each embody different aspects of connection between humans, gods, and environment. From the planetary perspective, the emphasis on mountains and caves mirrors broader human patterns of associating elevation and depth with sacredness seen from the Andes to the Himalayas. In Crete, this association gains particular resonance on an island where peaks dominate horizons and caves open beneath every ridge. The Minoan fusion of art and belief thus builds a cultural identity, distinct yet connected to wider Bronze Age traditions. Art embodies values of motion, nature, and ritual. Belief integrates economic storage with cosmic order. The lack of war imagery stands out. While contemporaneous cultures glorify battle, Minoan art almost entirely avoids it. This does not mean Crete lacked conflict, but it suggests that ideology emphasized harmony, fertility, and ritual spectacle. Authority expressed itself through frescoes of lilies and dolphins, through ceremonies in courts, through libations poured before horns of consecration. The message was one of integration rather than domination, yet the same integration binds society tightly to its symbols. When disasters come, when external powers intrude, the continuity of art and belief will be tested. For now, however, the island thrives in color and ceremony. Walls glow with pigments, shrines hold figurines, vessels pour libations, and seal stones carry images of ritual across the island. In this world, art and religion are not separate categories, but two faces of the same order, anchoring Minoan society in a shared symbolic language that resonates across centuries and across seas. The rise of maritime trade transforms Minoan Crete from an island culture into a thalassocracy, a sea power, whose influence spreads across the Aegean and beyond. Archaeological evidence confirms a clear fact. Minoan pottery, particularly Kamares ware with its fine polychrome decoration, appears across the Cyclades in Anatolia in the Levant, and even in Egypt by the early 2nd millennium BCE. These finds mark the reach of Minoan exchange networks, showing that Cretan ships carried not only goods, but also cultural forms across seas. Harbors at Kamos, Amnisos, and Zakros served as gateways linking inland palaces to maritime routes. Surpluses of oil, wine wool, and crafted goods left the island, while metals such as copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and luxury items from Egypt arrived, enabling workshops to produce bronze tools and ornaments. The maritime orientation is reinforced by the ubiquity of marine motifs in art. Octopuses unfurl tentacles across storage jars, dolphins leap on fresco walls, and nautilus shells curve on seal stones. A lesser-known detail comes from ship models and depictions on seals and frescoes. These images show long, narrow vessels with high prows and multiple rowers, sometimes accompanied by sails. The scale suggests organized fleets rather than isolated traders. The flotilla fresco from Thera illustrates ships in procession, with decorated hulls, cabins, and lines of oars indicating both ceremonial and practical roles for naval expeditions. Whether these images depict Minoan ships themselves or communities influenced by them, they testify to the centrality of seafaring. The unresolved mystery lies in the nature of Minoan maritime power. Ancient writers later credit Minos with ruling the sea, and the absence of fortifications on early palaces has been taken as evidence that Crete relied on naval supremacy to secure peace. Yet direct evidence for warships, naval battles, or formal empire is lacking. Was Minoan dominance coercive, extracting tribute from Cycladic islands, or was it primarily economic, sustained by trade and prestige goods? The debate continues, but all agree that seafaring shaped Minoan prosperity. On the planetary scale, Minoan trade situates Crete within Bronze Age exchange systems that linked distant regions. Copper from Cyprus and tin from Anatolia allowed bronze production, a technology spreading from Europe to South Asia. Trade with Egypt connected Crete to the Nile's agricultural wealth and the state's demand for luxury goods. Connections with the Levant tied the island into networks that also linked Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Crete's central position made it a hinge in the east-west and north-south flow of commodities, ideas, and technologies across the Mediterranean. Palaces coordinated this exchange. Storerooms filled with surplus not only supported local redistribution, but also provided cargo for ships. Ceilings and linear A tablets track consignments of oil or textiles, ensuring accountability across distances. The workshops attached to palaces produced standardized goods, such as fine textiles, which could circulate as prestige commodities. Bronze workshops refined imported metals into tools and weapons, while stone carvers turned imported materials into luxury objects. Thus, trade-fed workshops supplied goods, and goods sustained trade. The system reinforced itself with the sea as its medium. The lesser-known harbor of Kamos on the south coast near Phaistos illustrates this integration. Excavations reveal warehouses, ship sheds, and imported materials, confirming its role as a node where inland and overseas economies converged. Amnisos, the port of Knossos, connects directly to the palace, with references preserved in later Greek memory. Zakros, at the island's eastern tip, sits at a strategic location facing Cyprus and the Levant. These harbors form an outward-facing infrastructure, each tied to a palatial center. Minoan ships also carried cultural influence. The spread of Cretan pottery styles, fresco techniques, and symbols shows that trade was a conduit for ideas. Cycladic islands adopt motifs of spirals and marine imagery. Sites on the Greek mainland show Cretan influence in architecture and art, whether through direct colonization, elite emulation, or itinerant artisans. Minoan aesthetics ripple outward. The unresolved question remains whether Minoan control extended into political dominance or remained cultural and economic. Some scholars suggest tribute systems, citing concentrations of Cretan goods on other islands. Others see voluntary exchange with Minoan prestige drawing demand. Without written evidence, interpretation relies on distribution patterns and architecture. Regardless, the result is an Aegean world where Minoan style becomes pervasive. On the larger Mediterranean canvas, Crete participates in an era of intensifying maritime connectivity. Egyptian records mention Keftiu interpreted as Crete or Cretans bringing gifts of vases, metal, and textiles. The Uluburun shipwreck centuries later, but illustrative, shows the kind of mixed cargo that likely moved through Minoan harbors, copper, tin, glass, ivory, resins, and luxury goods. Crete stands at the center of this circulation, both beneficiary and contributor. A planetary perspective emphasizes how maritime trade binds distant ecologies. Olives and grapes grown on terraced hillsides in Crete become oil and wine consumed in Egypt or the Levant. Copper mined in Cyprus flows to Cretan workshops, reemerges as tools, and travels again to mainland Greece. Shells from the Red Sea appear in Cretan jewelry. The island is thus not isolated, but deeply entangled with lands far beyond sight. This entanglement both enriches and exposes. Prosperity depends on stable sea lanes, cooperative neighbors, and predictable winds. Seasonal rhythms structure voyages. The summer Etesians propel southbound trips, while winter storms discourage long crossings. Mariners adapt to cycles of wind and current timing departures to maximize efficiency. Knowledge of stars and coastlines guides navigation, embedding astronomy and geography into seafaring practice. The sea, however, is not only a connector, but also a risk. Storms sink ships' currents, sweep them off course, and pirates or rival powers threaten cargo. A system built on maritime exchange remains vulnerable to disruption. Yet in this period, Crete flourishes. Palaces brim with imported goods, frescoes depict ships proudly, and pottery circulates across regions. The image of the octopus wrapping its arms around a jar becomes almost emblematic of a society whose reach extends outward in every direction. This expansion reshapes identity. Minoans see themselves not merely as islanders, but as participants in a wide Mediterranean world. Their palaces, workshops, and rituals reflect this integration. Egyptian pigments appear in frescoes, Levantine ivories sit in shrines, Anatolian metals fuel workshops. Crete becomes a crossroads, not just geographically, but materially and culturally. Authority rests partly on the ability to sustain this flow. Administrators who control storerooms, workshops, and ships control wealth and power. Ritual reinforces legitimacy by tying abundance to divine favor. Art celebrates the sea not only as environment, but as source of prosperity. The maritime orientation becomes ideology, projecting an image of Crete as master of seas. From a planetary lens, Minoan trade illustrates how early complex societies rely on interconnected networks rather than isolation. Crete's prosperity is inseparable from distant mines, deltas, and forests. The island becomes a node in a vast web of human movement that foreshadows later globalization. In this moment, Minoan Crete thrives as a maritime power, its ships gliding across Aegean waters, its goods exchanged in distant harbors, its influence radiating through art and architecture. The palaces hum with activity. Storerooms fill workshops, produce, and frescoes record a society confident in its mastery of sea routes. Yet as with every system dependent on external flows, vulnerabilities lie beneath the surface. Shifts in trade competition from neighbors or natural disasters could unravel this delicate balance. For now, however, Minoan Crete stands at its zenith, a thalassocracy whose prosperity rests on the restless surface of the sea. Everyday life in Minoan Crete is less monumental than the palaces, but no less revealing of the structures that sustain a flourishing society. Archaeology offers one reliable fact: settlements beyond Knossos Phaistos, and other centers show planned houses, paved streets, drainage channels, and workshops, all signs that prosperity was broadly shared beyond elite compounds. At places like Gornia on the north coast, narrow lanes thread between multi-room houses, some with upper stories, staircases, and built hearths. The uniformity of construction materials, fieldstone foundations, mud brick walls, timber beams demonstrates a shared architectural language across classes. The integration of drains and water conduits into modest houses indicates that attention to comfort and hygiene was not limited to palaces. A lesser-known detail lies in loom weights and spindle whorls, found in many houses, showing that textile production was part of household activity. Women and men together participated in weaving, spinning, and dyeing, creating both domestic goods and surpluses for trade. Wool from sheep grazed in uplands became a key export commodity, transformed in workshops into fine textiles valued across the Aegean. The unresolved mystery is the exact role of gender in Minoan society. Frescoes depict women in prominent roles, and rituals and figurines suggest priestly authority, yet the absence of written texts prevents certainty about status. Did women hold institutional power, or was their visibility primarily symbolic? Archaeologists debate the degree to which Minoan society was matrilineal, egalitarian, or structured along different lines. The ambiguity remains, but the material record consistently highlights women's central presence in imagery and daily production. On a planetary scale, everyday life in Crete mirrors broader patterns of Bronze Age complexity. Agricultural surplus supports urban-style settlements. Craft specialization integrates into economies, and households tie into regional and global exchange systems. Yet Crete's version is distinctive in its apparent emphasis on aesthetic integration pottery, with marine motifs appears not only in elite contexts, but in domestic ones, suggesting that artistic expression permeated daily use. Agriculture remains the backbone of life. Farmers cultivate barley, wheat, lentils, and chickpeas on terraced slopes and plains. Olive groves provide oil for cooking, lighting, and ritual. Vineyards managed through pruning and careful storage supply wine. Herds of sheep and goats graze on uplands, while cattle plow fields and serve symbolic roles in ritual. Beehives evidenced by clay models produce honey as sweetener and possible offering. Archaeobotanical remains confirm the presence of figs, pears, and pomegranates, linking diet to broader Mediterranean cultivation. Storage pits, jars, and granaries in villages ensure food security across seasons. This diversified economy allows resilience against local fluctuations. Though dependence on trade creates larger vulnerabilities, craft specialization flourishes alongside farming. Potters shape fine camarays, ware with thin walls, and polychrome decoration, later producing marine-style vessels with octopuses and nautili. Metalworkers cast bronze tools and ornaments, importing copper and tin from abroad. Stone carvers engrave seal stones with intricate motifs, some so minute that they require magnification today to appreciate. Artisans and workshops attached to palaces produce standardized goods, but village households also contribute, blurring lines between domestic and specialized production. A lesser-known practice is the use of faience and glass paste materials, imitating precious stones, showing that Minoan craftsmen experimented with exotic technologies adopted from Egypt and the Near East. Daily life unfolds within a social fabric knit by ritual and festival. Houses often include small shrines or niches where figurines, libation tables, or horns of consecration appear, suggesting that religion permeated domestic spaces. Communal feasting, attested by large storage jars and serving vessels, likely marked seasonal gatherings, reinforcing cohesion. Frescoes of processions may echo these real events where entire communities participated in offerings tied to agricultural cycles. Music and dance, suggested by instruments and figurines, animate social life. In this society, the line between sacred and everyday blurs. Another unresolved question is the degree of literacy in daily life. Linear A tablets and ceilings cluster in palaces, suggesting administrative use. Yet the presence of inscribed objects in smaller sites hints that writing may have had limited penetration into local contexts. Was literacy confined to a small administrative class, or did it reach merchants and artisans without decipherment? The scale of literacy remains uncertain. Regardless, symbolic systems such as seal stones suggest a wide familiarity with iconography, even if texts were not widely read. From the planetary perspective, Minoan daily life shows how households link to global flows. Olive oil pressed in a village could end up in a jar traded to Egypt. Wool spun on a domestic loom could travel to the Levant. Copper from Cyprus could be transformed in a small workshop into a tool for local farmers. Thus, even modest activities tied households to distant landscapes. Climate stability in the mid-second millennium supports prosperity with steady rainfall, allowing consistent harvests, though occasional droughts or earthquakes remind communities of fragility. The integration of storage and redistribution helps buffer against shocks, but dependence on maritime networks remains constant. houses themselves embody resilience. Thick walls of stone and mud brick insulate against summer heat and winter chill. Timber frames allow flexibility during tremors. Courtyards open houses to light and air, creating shared spaces for work and interaction. Cooking hearths, ovens, and storage pits cluster in these spaces, showing that households function as both production and consumption units. Multi-room structures suggest extended families living together, pooling labor and resources. Children likely participated in farming and craft, from early ages learning skills embedded in daily routines. Domestic rituals bind families to wider religious systems. Figurines of animals, miniature vessels, and double axes appear in household contexts, showing that offerings were not confined to palaces. This diffusion of sacred objects suggests a decentralized religious life where households engaged directly with divine forces. Feasting processions and shared ceremonies connected households to communities and communities to palaces, creating a continuum from the smallest shrine to the grandest court. On the Mediterranean stage, Minoan daily life appears distinctive for its absence of militarism. Unlike the Mycenaean mainland, where fortresses and weapons dominate the record, Crete's domestic sites show more emphasis on craft, storage, and ritual. This does not mean violence was absent, but ideology favored images of abundance and ceremony. The planetary observation here is that societies can organize around different emphases. Some valorize warfare, others trade, others ritual. Minoan Crete, at least in its peak centuries, organizes around prosperity, aesthetics, and sacred integration. Yet beneath the prosperity lies fragility. Households depend on surplus funneled through palaces. Artisans rely on imported metals. Farmers rely on steady rainfall. When external shocks or internal disruptions come, the everyday structures that once sustained resilience may prove vulnerable. For now, though, daily life in Minoan Crete appears balanced and prosperous. Villages hum with weaving pottery and farming. Courtyards echo with laughter work and ritual. Palaces coordinate, but households participate actively in the same networks. Art and belief permeate even modest houses, making daily life itself an expression of cultural values. The society flourishes not only in monumental courts, but in kitchens, workshops, and fields where countless hands sustain the island's golden age. This integration of domestic, economic, and sacred life gives Minoan Crete its distinctive texture, a civilization where prosperity and ritual are inseparable, where daily labor feeds into trade, and where the rhythm of households matches the rhythm of seas and seasons. The enigma of writing and administration on Minoan Crete has long fascinated scholars because it reveals a society skilled in record-keeping, yet still silent to us in meaning. A fact confirmed by archaeology is that the island produced at least 3 distinct scripts: Cretan hieroglyphic linear A and later linear B, when Mycenaeans took control. Of these, only linear B has been deciphered, and it represents an intrusive system brought by mainland Greeks. The original Minoan scripts, particularly linear A, remain undeciphered despite decades of study. Clay tablet ceilings and inscriptions show that writing was central to palace administration. They record tallies of goods storage allocations and perhaps ritual offerings. The material is abundant enough to prove widespread bureaucratic use, yet the meaning is still locked. A lesser-known detail is the variety of media, not only clay tablets, but also stone libation tables, gold rings, and ceramic vessels bear linear A inscriptions, suggesting that writing served both administrative and ritual functions. The unresolved mystery is the language behind the script. Was Minoan speech related to known families such as Indo-European or Semitic, or was it an isolate with no surviving relatives until decipherment we cannot know? This mystery emphasizes how much of Minoan thought and social organization remains inaccessible. On a planetary scale, the existence of writing places Minoan Crete within the broader Bronze Age literate world, alongside Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, yet with a distinct trajectory. While those civilizations left rich textual corpora, Minoan writing is fragmentary and undeciphered, forcing reliance on architecture, art, and distribution patterns rather than text to reconstruct history. Administration, however, is legible through practice. Seal stones carved with intricate motifs served as personal or institutional identifiers pressed into clay. Thousands survive, testifying to a system where authenticity and responsibility mattered. Sealed jars, doors, and containers meant that goods could be tracked from producer to palace storeroom. This system of secure movement resembles a bureaucratic chain of custody. Even without understanding the inscriptions, the presence of systematic seals and tablets demonstrates a sophisticated awareness of accountability. Linear A tablets show columns of symbols, repeated signs, and numerical notations. Although meaning is unknown, patterns suggest inventories entries for commodities such as grain oil or textiles. Numerical signs resemble tallies indicating quantities, while recurring ideograms may denote types of goods. The fire that destroyed palaces inadvertently preserved these tablets by baking them. Thus, disasters serve as archives, giving us glimpses into an otherwise ephemeral record-keeping system. The broader implication is that the palace functioned as a central node of economic memory, storing not only goods but also information. A lesser-known aspect is that some linear A inscriptions appear in sanctuaries carved into libation tables and ritual vessels. This dual context suggests that writing was not confined to administration, but extended into sacred life. Perhaps prayers, dedications, or ritual formulae were inscribed, combining practical and spiritual roles. If so, writing bound economy and religion together as tightly as architecture did. The unresolved question of literacy arises here. Was writing restricted to a small class of scribes, or did merchants and artisans also use it? The consistency of sign forms suggests trained specialists, yet the distribution of inscriptions in non-palatial contexts hints at broader familiarity. The inability to read linear A prevents clarity, but the debate continues. Regardless, the existence of systematic record-keeping implies that administrators coordinated resources across the island. From the planetary perspective, the invention and use of writing in Crete demonstrates a universal human drive to stabilize memory across time and space. Just as cuneiform in Mesopotamia recorded barley rations and hieroglyphs in Egypt tracked temple offerings, linear A tablets tallied Minoan surpluses. Writing emerges not first to record stories, but to manage food labor and ritual. In Crete, this function is consistent with global patterns, reminding us that the origins of literacy lie in the needs of complex societies to manage abundance. Administration extended beyond writing. Palatial architecture channeled goods through specific entry points, corridors, and storerooms, making the building itself a mechanism of control. Storage magazines lined with pithoi standardized containers. Ceilings ensured accountability. Workshops attached to palaces allowed raw materials to be collected, processed, and redistributed within controlled contexts. These practices reveal a bureaucratic mentality to count, store, monitor, and release in regulated fashion. The combination of writing, sealing, and architecture produces a system that anticipates later bureaucracies in principle, if not in scale. A lesser-known observation is the role of numerical systems. Linear A includes clear signs for numbers some resembling base 10 others, possibly base 60. This duality may reflect influences from both Egyptian decimal and Mesopotamian sexagesimal traditions carried into Crete through trade. If true, it shows how administration integrated not only goods, but also mathematical concepts from abroad. The unresolved mystery of whether linear A recorded one or multiple languages persists. Some scholars suggest bilingualism with different scripts serving different functions. Others argue for continuity of a single Minoan tongue. Until decipherment, the linguistic identity of the Minoans remains one of prehistory's greatest unknowns. Planetary connections frame this mystery. The undeciphered Indus script contemporaneous with linear A represents another case where administration survives without meaning. These parallels remind us that civilizations can be archaeologically visible, yet linguistically silent, forcing us to reconstruct worlds without voices. For Minoan Crete, silence does not mean absence of complexity. Rather, it challenges us to read material systems of power without words. Daily practice reflects this complexity. Farmers delivered produce sealed and recorded. Artisans produced goods tracked by administrators. Palaces redistributed surpluses during festivals or crises. Writing stabilized these flows, but it also extended into ritual binding, economy, and belief. In this way, Minoan administration reveals the inseparability of practical and sacred realms. From the planetary lens, the system illustrates the fragility of knowledge. A script undeciphered becomes a barrier to understanding entire lifeways. Our view of Minoan society is filtered through silence. Yet the very existence of that script proves their participation in a literate, interconnected Bronze Age world. Even without voices, their marks endure on clay and stone, whispering of lists, prayers, and laws we cannot yet hear. The palaces embody these systems, their magazines filled with jars sealed against tampering, their archives, once full of tablets, now preserved only by chance. Authority operates through invisibility as much as visibility. No royal statues dominate squares. No great inscriptions proclaim conquests, but clay and seal tell us that someone somewhere counted, recorded, and commanded. The administrative machine hums silently in the background of Minoan life, as central to its prosperity as ships or fields. In this moment, Crete thrives on systems both material and symbolic. Goods move from field to storeroom to ship, marked by seals and recorded on tablets. Rituals unfold in courts, where inscriptions on libation tables may have invoked divine witnesses. Information and surplus intertwine, giving Minoan society resilience and order. Yet fragility lurks in reliance on specialized knowledge. If scribes vanish, if records burn, if sealings fail, the system falters. The same literacy that stabilizes can also conceal. For now, though, the system holds. Clay tablets rest in storerooms. Sealings harden on jars. Scribes press styluses into wet surfaces, and palaces function as both granaries and archives. In this balance of stone clay and symbol, Minoan Crete organizes itself into one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Its language remains lost, but its structures speak clearly of a civilization that managed abundance with care, precision, and ritual integration. Disasters and instability mark a turning point in the history of Minoan Crete, exposing vulnerabilities within systems that once seemed enduring. Archaeology provides a firm fact: the eruption of the volcano at Thera, modern Santorini, in the mid-2nd millennium BCE ranks among the largest volcanic events of the Holocene. Layers of pumice, ash, and tsunami deposits along Crete's north coast attest to its impact. Radiocarbon and ice core data place the eruption around the 17th or 16th century BCE, though debate continues over exact dating. The explosion obliterated the settlement at Akrotiri, burying frescoed houses under meters of ash, preserving a Minoan outpost in remarkable detail, but ending its life. Tsunami waves generated by the collapse of the caldera swept southward, striking Cretan harbors. A lesser-known detail lies in the pumice deposits found as far south as Libya, showing how planetary-scale forces reached across seas, altering coastlines and ecosystems. The unresolved mystery is the role this eruption played in the decline of Minoan power. Some argue it fatally disrupted trade and agriculture. Others maintain that Minoan society endured for decades after adapting but weakened. The lack of precise chronological alignment between eruption and palatial collapse complicates the story. What is clear is that natural disasters were recurrent seismic tremors, repeatedly damaged palaces and fires, gutted storerooms. Crete lay on a tectonic boundary where instability was the norm. On the planetary scale, the eruption influenced climate beyond the Aegean. Ice cores from Greenland suggest atmospheric dust veils that could have cooled northern hemispheric climates for seasons affecting harvests far away. Such teleconnections remind us that an island event reverberated globally, linking Crete to atmospheric systems spanning continents. Earthquakes remain a constant. Timber-laced walls and rebuilt floors attest to repeated destruction. The first palaces around 1900 BCE fall around 1700 BCE, likely due to quakes, only to be rebuilt grander in the so-called Neo-Palatial period. This cycle reveals resilience, but also costs draining resources into reconstruction. Each rebuilding inscribes memory of instability into architecture itself. The eruption of Thera, however, compounded stresses. Beyond immediate destruction, it likely disrupted sea routes. Ash clouds may have hindered navigation and agriculture, while tsunamis damaged ports. Harbors like Knossos show deposits consistent with marine inundation. The blow to infrastructure would have reverberated through trade networks on which Crete's prosperity depended. A lesser-known observation is the possible ecological aftermath. Pumice rafts floating across the Aegean may have clogged harbors and fishing grounds for months. Ash fallout, though patchy, may have altered soil fertility temporarily. Such environmental effects would have unsettled rhythms of farming and seafaring. The unresolved question is why Minoan palaces collapse finally around 1450 BCE, decades after the eruption. Some suggest that cumulative stress, quakes, tsunamis, shifting trade routes, eroded stability until external powers like the Mycenaeans stepped in. Others argue for internal strife elites competing as resources dwindled. Without deciphered texts, causation remains elusive. What emerges is a pattern. Disasters do not destroy outright, but destabilize, making societies more vulnerable to subsequent shocks. From the planetary perspective, the Minoan experience illustrates how local hazards intertwine with global systems. A volcano on one island disrupts networks across seas, cooling climates, shifting trade, and altering food security. Earthquakes and eruptions are geological constants, but their impact depends on the social fabric. For Crete, dependence on centralized storage and maritime exchange magnified vulnerability. When harbors flooded or storerooms burned, entire systems faltered. Archaeological strata preserve these crises. At Knossos, collapsed walls, burnt magazines, and smashed jars tell of sudden destruction. At Phaistos, rebuilt structures overlay ruins of earlier palaces. At Malea and Zakros, final destructions around 1450 BCE left debris layers thick with ash and rubble. These material records are silent about causes, but eloquent about violence of events. The pattern of widespread synchronous destruction suggests more than local accidents. It points to systemic disruption. A lesser-known clue is the distribution of Mycenaean pottery in post-destruction levels. This suggests that external powers exploited instability, inserting themselves into networks once dominated by Crete. Thus, disasters open the door to foreign influence. The unresolved mystery of how Cretan communities experience these crises remains. Did survivors flee inland, abandon harbors, or migrate to other islands? Were rituals altered in response to catastrophe? Evidence of mass burials is scarce, leaving open questions about mortality. Yet cultural memory of disaster may echo in later Greek myths, tales of Atlantis, of floods of wrathful gods punishing hubris. Whether or not these stories recall Thera, they show how memory of catastrophe embeds into regional imagination. Planetary scale changes remind us that civilizations rise in windows of climatic stability, but must endure instability as norm. The mid-2nd millennium BCE saw not only Thera's eruption, but also drought episodes in the Near East migrations and shifting trade patterns. Crete's crisis fits into this wider mosaic where interconnected societies transmitted shocks rapidly across regions. The strength of Minoan resilience rebuilding after earthquakes, reorganizing after eruptions delays, but does not prevent eventual decline. For a time after Thera palaces continue workshops, hum, and frescoes flourish. The system absorbs shock but grows brittle. When the next round of crises comes, the structures break. In the meantime, architecture bears scars. Rebuilt staircases, patched walls, and redesigned courts show adaptation. Ritual may have intensified as communities sought divine favor against instability. Offerings at peak sanctuaries increased during periods of disruption, suggesting a cultural response to natural threat. Caves fill with votives of animals and figurines, perhaps prayers for stability in unstable times. From a planetary lens, the story of Minoan disasters is not unique, but exemplary. Societies across history confront volcanoes, quakes, and storms. Their survival depends on resilience and flexibility. Minoan Crete shows both ingenuity in rebuilding, creativity in adaptation, but vulnerability and dependence on fragile systems. The sea that enriched also exposed the palaces that stored, also centralized risk. The rituals that unified also tied legitimacy to divine favor, vulnerable to failure. In this moment, instability defines experience. Waves crash into harbors, quakes, shatter walls, ash drifts from distant islands. Yet life goes on. Farmers sow, potters shape, weavers spin. The contradiction of resilience and fragility characterizes Minoan Crete in its later centuries. From splendor, it moves toward uncertainty, each disaster not an end, but a step toward decline. What once seemed eternal in stone now reveals itself contingent, subject to forces of earth and sky. The island endures, but the civilization bends, and in bending exposes the limits of its strength. Decline and the shadow of Mycenae spread gradually across Crete in the 15th century BCE as the once flourishing palatial system falters and foreign influence grows unmistakable. Archaeology provides a firm fact: by around 1450 BCE, most Minoan palaces, Malia, Zakros, Phaistos, suffer final destructions, leaving Knossos as the sole surviving center. In the layers that follow, Mycenaean pottery architecture and administrative practices appear signaling that mainland powers from Mycenae and other sites in Greece asserted dominance over the weakened island. The evidence is clear in writing. Linear B, the Mycenaean adaptation of Minoan script, appears at Knossos by the later 15th century. Unlike Linear A, Linear B has been deciphered and records Greek language listing rations, land, and goods. This provides direct proof that Mycenaean administrators operated within the ruins of Minoan power, absorbing and adapting its systems. A lesser-known detail is the continuity of certain religious symbols, even under Mycenaean control. Horns of consecration, double axes, and libation tables continue to appear, showing that invaders adopted local traditions to legitimize their authority. Rather than erasing Minoan culture, the Mycenaeans repurposed it, blending elements into their own system of kingship and fortress society. The unresolved mystery is the manner of takeover. Was it violent conquest, opportunistic occupation after disasters, or a gradual infiltration of traders and elites? The archaeological record shows destruction layers, but whether these result from invasion or internal collapse remains debated. The absence of widespread fortifications on Crete complicates interpretation. Did the Minoans fall to military force, or did their society erode until external powers stepped in to fill the void? What is certain is that the palatial network shrank to a single node Knossos now under foreign control. On the planetary scale, this transition mirrors a broader pattern in the late Bronze Age, when power shifted frequently as regions faced droughts, migrations, and political upheaval. Crete's fall fits into a Mediterranean tapestry of instability, with societies across the Levant, Anatolia, and Egypt also confronting change. Minoan civilization does not vanish overnight. Villages continue, artisans produce, rituals persist, yet the palatial order that once unified the island breaks. Knossos alone functions now a Mycenaean palace rather than a Minoan one. Tablets written in Linear B reveal new administrative structures. Land is allocated to officials' rations distributed to workers, offerings recorded for gods. This system resembles mainland palatial bureaucracy, hierarchical and militarized, in contrast to the earlier, more enigmatic Minoan model. The presence of warriors and weapons in art increases, suggesting that the ethos of Mycenaean society overlays Minoan traditions. A lesser-known observation is that tombs shift in style. Chamber tombs with mainland features replace earlier Cretan practices, indicating the cultural reach of Mycenaean elites. Yet continuity exists in domestic life. Pottery retains marine motif shrines, still host figurines, peak sanctuaries continue to receive offerings. This blending of traditions shows that cultural memory endured even as political control shifted. The unresolved question remains why Knossos persisted longest. Its location, central and well-connected, may have given it resilience. Its size and resources allowed recovery when others collapsed. Or perhaps Mycenaeans deliberately chose Knossos as their base, recognizing its strategic value. Whatever the reason, the palace becomes a bridge between two civilizations, preserving fragments of Minoan practice while transmitting them into a new order. On the planetary scale, the shift from Minoan to Mycenaean Crete illustrates how civilizations can be absorbed rather than annihilated. Minoan scripts, art, and symbols filter into Mycenaean culture, which later passes them into the wider Greek world. Even in decline, Crete influences its conquerors, shaping the development of Aegean civilization. Economic patterns also shift. Maritime trade, once dominated by Minoans, now channels through Mycenaean networks. Evidence of Cretan goods abroad diminishes, while Mycenaean pottery appears widely across the Mediterranean. Crete becomes one node within a mainland-centered system. The island's autonomy ends, but its infrastructure remains useful to new masters. The decline has social consequences. Villages once tied to palaces lose their central authority, forcing households to adapt. Craft production continues, but workshops are reorganized. Some sites shrink or are abandoned, reflecting population redistribution. The sense of order that palatial centers embodied disappears, replaced by regional diversity under Mycenaean oversight. The lesser-known clue of shrine continuity at peak sanctuaries shows resilience of local traditions. Offerings increase in some sanctuaries even after palatial collapse, suggesting that in times of political uncertainty, communities turn more to the divine. Religious continuity bridges cultural transition, preserving identity, while elites change. The unresolved question of population remains: did Crete experience demographic decline, with people killed, displaced, or enslaved, or did populations remain stable under new rulers? Archaeological evidence is ambiguous. Some settlements persist, others vanish. The scale of human suffering is hard to measure, but cultural transformation is evident. From the planetary perspective, the fall of Minoan Crete reflects how environmental stress and geopolitical pressure converge. Disasters weaken external powers, exploit, and cultural synthesis results. Civilizations rarely vanish without trace. They transform, leaving legacies within successors. Minoan Crete becomes part of Mycenaean Greece, and through Mycenae part of classical memory. In this moment of decline, the grandeur of Minoan palaces gives way to Mycenaean fortress society. Yet echoes remain. Frescoes still depict nature. Shrines still hold figurines. Artisans still carve intricate seals. The civilization bends, adapts, and transmits its essence. Knossos, under new masters, stands as the last flicker of Minoan order its walls, now hearing a new language, its storerooms serving a new system. From Splendor, Crete passes into shadow, not extinguished, but transformed, absorbed into a larger Aegean world. This transformation marks the close of independence, but ensures survival through legacy. The island ceases to be a thalassocracy, yet its art symbols and myths endure, carried forward by those who conquered. In decline, Minoan Crete still shapes the path of Mediterranean civilization. Ruins and enduring legacy are what remain when the palaces of Crete fall silent. Their storerooms burned, their courts abandoned, their frescoes fading under time. Archaeology offers one firm fact: after 1200 BCE, palatial systems vanish entirely from Crete, and the island no longer functions as a major power in the Aegean. Knossos, the last stronghold of Mycenaean administration, is destroyed around 1375 BCE, leaving no palace rebuilt in its place. What follows are centuries of smaller settlements, scattered shrines, and fragmented traditions. Yet the memory of Minoan greatness does not die. Greek mythology later remembers Minos, the labyrinth, and the Minotaur, echoing the grandeur of Knossos in distorted form. The ruins themselves, with corridors winding and staircases climbing, may have inspired the legend of the labyrinth. A lesser-known detail lies in the survival of religious practices at peak sanctuaries and caves well into the post-palatial period. Figurines, libation tables, and offerings continue to appear, showing that even as political systems collapse, sacred traditions persist. This continuity suggests that ordinary communities preserved identity through ritual, even as palatial elites vanished. The unresolved mystery is how much of this memory was continuous and how much reinvented by later Greeks. Did oral traditions carry stories of palaces and rituals across centuries? Or did myths of Theseus and the Minotaur emerge from Greek encounters with Minoan ruins long after the blend of memory and invention makes it difficult to disentangle? On a planetary scale, the decline of Minoan Crete reflects a broader, late Bronze Age collapse that swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Cities from Hattusa to Ugarit fell, trade routes fractured, and populations migrated. Though Crete's palatial collapse predates this wider crisis, its trajectory fits into the pattern of interconnected societies vulnerable to cascading disruption. Minoan Crete thus serves as an early example of how environmental stress, external pressure, and internal fragility converge to end complex systems. Yet the legacy endures in more than myth. Artistic motifs, spirals, marine imagery, naturalistic scenes reappear in later Greek art, though adapted to new contexts. Religious symbols such as the double axe and horns of consecration persist in cult practice. Techniques of architecture from ashlar masonry to light wells influence Aegean building traditions. Even the undeciphered scripts, Linear A and Cretan, hieroglyphic, leave an imprint for their successor, Linear B, though written in Greek preserves the administrative form established earlier. A lesser-known observation is that even in post-palatial times, Cretans continued to export pottery, though in reduced volumes. This suggests that while political structures collapsed, craft traditions remained valued abroad. Continuity in daily practices allowed survival even without centralized power. The unresolved question of identity persists. Were later Cretans direct heirs of Minoan culture, maintaining continuity through centuries of change, or did waves of newcomers reshape the island so fully that Minoan identity dissolved? Archaeological evidence shows both continuity in shrines and shifts in pottery, making the answer ambiguous. Memory, however, endured beyond the island. For Greeks of the classical period, Crete was a land of ancient kings and monstrous myths. Minos became both lawgiver and tyrant judge in Hades and builder of the labyrinth. The bull, central in Minoan ritual, reappeared in myth as the Minotaur. Ariadne, linked to thread and labyrinth, entered Greek storytelling as helper of heroes. These myths, though, preserve echoes of rituals, architecture, and symbols that once defined Minoan belief. On the planetary scale, Minoan Crete's legacy illustrates how civilizations survive in cultural memory, even when political systems collapse. The island ceases to dominate seas, but its myths dominate imagination. Its ruins inspire stories across centuries, its symbols endure in art, and its reputation as Europe's first great civilization persists into modern scholarship. Ruins themselves tell stories. Excavations at Knossos reveal staircases leading to nowhere courts, opening onto Silence magazines empty of jars. At Phaistos, terraces overlook the Mesara plain, now quiet but once full of labor and ritual. At Zakros, storerooms filled with collapsed jars remind us of sudden destruction. These silent stones preserve both grandeur and fragility, testament to a society that reached high and endured long, but was not immune to time. A lesser-known point is how archaeology itself shapes legacy. The excavations of Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos in the early 20th century restored walls and painted reconstructions that remain controversial but influential. These reconstructions gave vivid form to Minoan culture in modern imagination, coloring perceptions of a society vibrant, peaceful, and aesthetic. Debate continues about whether this image romanticizes the past, yet it has cemented Minoan Crete in cultural memory as a golden age of Europe. The unresolved mystery that lingers is how Minoans saw themselves. Without deciphered texts, we cannot know what names they gave their gods, what myths they told, or what songs they sang in courts. We know them through fragments, frescoes of dancers, figurines of priestesses, tablets of numbers. Their voice remains silent, yet their material world speaks eloquently. On a planetary level, this silence is a reminder of limits of knowledge. Civilizations can rise, flourish, and leave magnificent ruins, yet without texts. Their inner thoughts remain elusive. Minoan Crete embodies both the grandeur of human achievement and the humility of what cannot be recovered. Even so, legacy persists through myths of Minos, Theseus, and Ariadne, through symbols of bulls and labyrinths, through art that echoes across millennia. Minoan Crete endures. Its palaces lie in ruins, but its influence continues woven into the fabric of Greek culture, and through Greece into the heritage of Europe. From splendor to ruin, the story of Minoan Crete demonstrates the cycles of rise and fall that mark human history, where greatness leaves behind fragments that inspire those who follow. In the silence of its ruins, Crete still speaks, reminding us that civilizations pass, but their echoes remain carried forward in stone, in myth, and in memory.